Our other presenter is Abraham Kim. He's a Northeast Asia analyst covering South Korea and North Korea in the Eurasia Group's Asia practice. Kim also provides tabletop exercises and war games expertise for the firm. Before joining the firm, he served as a project manager and national security policy analyst for Science Application International Corporation, where he managed dozens of tabletop exercises, war games, and crisis management exercises, and developed alternative analytical methodologies for the U.S. Department of Defense, intelligence community, and commercial sector. He also previously worked as Northeast Asia security analyst for the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and the Center for Korean Research, East Asian Institute at Columbia University in New York. His extensive writing on the region has appeared in the Asian Wall Street Journal, Washington Times, the Korea Times, Korea Journal of Defense Analysis, and Journal of International Affairs. He received a BA from Boston University, an MA from Harvard, and a PhD in political science from Columbia University.
My basic responsibility is covering Korea, the two Koreas. And it's a really exciting time right now to look at Korea because we have a new president, we had legislature elections last week, as well as some interesting times in North Korea. And I hope all of you continue to study Korea because there's a lot of interesting things that are going to be occurring in the next couple of years. But I want to focus my attention today on this particular gentleman, President Myung-bak, or as some people call him, MB. Since Jim did such a great job in providing an overview, I want to focus our attention on the president and provide kind of three perspectives on him. One is a profile, and I want to talk a little bit about his background, who he is, where he came from, his politics, some of the political intrigue that surrounds him, and how he got to become the president. And finally, address some of the policy issues that he's known for, and perhaps a little bit of critique of his policies. His profile. You know, President Lee is one of those classic cases of rags to riches. He was born in 1941 in Japan, in Osaka, and at a young age he came to Korea, Pohang, with 6 other siblings. 2 of them happened to die later on. But he lived in great poverty. If you read his autobiography, it talks about how he had to work from a young age. And he had to sell snacks, knickknacks, just to support his family. And many, many days he would go hungry. And there's stories about he and his sister would drink water because just to keep the hunger pangs down. And that his parents would go get wheat, leftover wheat from the local brewery because they couldn't afford wheat. But so he would go to school smelling like liquor because the wheat that he got was from the brewery. And people thought he was drinking as a child. So, but he worked hard, and he couldn't afford to go to regular high school, so he went to night high school. And the only way to pay for tuition was to be in first place. So for 3 years, he was in first place. And so he went on and worked hard and got into college, not knowing where he was going to pay for, how he was going to pay for the tuition. But he ended up going to the prestigious Korea University, which is in the top 3. Number one. And because he couldn't pay for tuition, he had to work. And so there are stories of him waking up at 4 o'clock every morning, shipping trash, hauling trash at the local marketplace to the dumpster so he can pay for his college. But not only was hardworking, but he had some certain leadership skills, and he ended up becoming the president for the business administration department. And he was also a student activist. And in 1964, the year before he graduated, he had organized this protest against then President Park Chung-hee, against the normalization of Korea-Japan. And he was imprisoned for 6 months, and he was blacklisted. And so when he graduated in 1965, he came out, like most college students, looking for a job, but he couldn't find a job. No one would give him a job because he was on the government's blacklist. So while most of his colleagues had been on this blacklist, went abroad to the US and various other places to study for college, Myung-bak wrote a letter to the president saying, Mr. President, if you can't let a healthy man work, then the nation will spend the rest of my life taking care of me. And so, as the story goes, then President Park sent an advisor to go talk to him, to Myung-bak, and he got off the blacklist. And he got hired by a small, then little-known company called Hyundai Construction. And back then, there were only 90 people working there. But in 12 years, Myung-bak became the president of Hyundai Construction and Engineering. And then after 27 years at Hyundai, he had become the CEO of 10 different Hyundai affiliates. And what was 90 people became 160,000 employees. And so in 1992, at the peak of his career, he ran into some problems with a gentleman by the name of Chung Ju-young, who's also the founder of Hyundai. And through some issues, he had to give up, had to retire from Hyundai. So what do you do as a CEO of a top business and at the top of your career, and you're out of a job? You go to politics. So he ran for office at the National Assembly, and he became a National Assemblyman for 2 terms. From 92 to 96, and then from 96 to 98. But like a lot of Korean politicians during this time who are involved with business and so forth, he had a slight personal problem. And that was the issue of corruption. And he got caught dealing with some campaign finance laws that he had broken. And then he had to give up his office. And so he disappeared from politics from 1998, and part of that time he spent in the United States. But he had the political itch again in 2002 for the Seoul mayor election. And in 2002, one of his primary promise was urban renewal. And it was to rebuild this buried stream in downtown Seoul called Cheonggyecheon, which was known at the time. It was a historic river, creek, whatever you want to call it, but it had become kind of over time, it had become a magnet for sewage, trash, poverty, and so forth. And this is what it looked like in the early days of Cheonggyecheon. As you can see, there's a lot of shanty shacks and so forth. And in the 1960s and 70s, Cheonggyecheon became a blight on the city. So at the top of Seoul's urbanization and industrialization, like what Korea did to a lot of different areas like this, they poured concrete over it. And they built basically highways and roads, and underneath there somewhere was the Cheonggyecheon River, and it looked like that. But Myung-bak, part of his promise was to revive this creek, this river, as a part of an urban renewal, as a part of to rejuvenate and bring back economic dynamism in Seoul, and to create this environmentally sensitive, environmentally positive, park or river or what do you want to call it. But there was a lot of opposition, and of course he won the mayorship. And there was a lot of opposition from civic groups, from environmentalists, from local businesses that this will be, environmentally disastrous, too expensive. We can't do this. But he did it anyways, and he bulldozed through that. And starting in 2002, he started the construction, and by 2005, October 1st, he opened it, and this is what it looks like today. So now it's a huge tourist attraction. And it's become this cultural center and but the river is not an actual river. It's actually a concrete man-made river, 5 kilometers long. But it's become this big tourist attraction, and all the highway is gone. What used to be the highway on top of it, it's all gone, and now it's this 5-kilometer river that has, it's almost artistic in its in its design. But of course, this helped Myung-bak to get a lot of not only national recognitions, but international recognition. And so in 2007, Time magazine called him one of the heroes of the environment for building this. So as the mayor of Seoul, on top of politics, on top of getting all this international recognition, what do in Korea? You run for president. So in 2007, May, he declared his candidacy for the president. But he had some problems. He ran to represent the opposition conservative party, Hannaradang, or GMP, or Grand National Party. But one of the main issues he had was that he had some pretty significant opposition, and he had some pretty tough competition, and one being this lady, former chairwoman Park Geun-hye, who was also who's the daughter of the former president Park Chung-hee. And she was extremely popular among the conservatives. But Myung-bak beat her by slim margins and went on to run for the presidential election. And here's Myung-bak had two broad platforms: strong growth and reciprocity with the North Koreans. No more of this asymmetric concessions to the North Koreans. Quid pro quo. And his main opponent, Chung Do-young, who was part of the, let's just say, called the liberal side, was running on a platform of balanced growth and continuation of North Korean engagement, or this continuation of sunshine policy. Later on, when Lee Myung-bak started running into some trouble, an ultra-right candidate, former chairman Lee Hae-chang, came in. But he ran on a policy of, let's get tough on North Korea, and that was basically his platform. But Lee Myung-bak was very popular, and he was running ahead, but he had a little personal problem that a lot of politicians run into: corruption. And it came back to bite him again. And this time there were issues of stock manipulation, tax evasion, all these allegations. But in the end, he was able to get over this and win the election. And his victory is a testament of how people were interested, wanted change from 10 years of liberal rule. And they wanted economic growth, and his message of economic growth really resonated with the general people. So with this kind of brief overview, this man who drove through business to the top, drove through business to become the top of his game in politics, what would you expect from a gentleman like this in terms of his policy? Something very ambitious and very aggressive. And so when he came into office, he came with 5 agendas, 21 strategy priorities, and 192 political tasks he wanted to achieve, basically to implement his 747 plan, as Jim had explained. And so rather than going through all of the policies and so forth that Jim had covered, I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach and talk about some of the issues that people have talked about regarding Lee Myung-bak, although he's been only in office for barely 2 months. And that's the caveat. We got to remember that he's only been in office for 2 months, so being critical of it may be a little bit unfair, but regardless, I'm going to put on my analytical hat. And one of the issues that people have is that he may be an imperial president. What do I mean by imperial president? A president who's strong, who's maybe over-dominant and overpowering, and probably even hearkening back to some of the days of the 70s and 80s of the Park Chung-hee era. And people point to 4 different issues. One was when he came into office, he did this completely corporate reorg of the government. If you can imagine this, 18 ministries and 2 sub-ministries existed. He came in and says, I'm going to cut it down to 13 ministries. Literally, you're saying, I want to come in, let's take the US government, for example. I'm going to cut out the Labor Department, I'm going to cut out the Interior Department, I'm going to cut out the State Department, I'm going to cut out DOT, and that's how I'm going to rule the country. So literally, he was cutting 7,000 civilian jobs, and And literally, he was trying to make it slimmer but meaner, as some would say. But some also thought of it as his opportunity to purge the bureaucracy of those who were not fully on supporting his agenda and supporting his what he wanted to do with the next administration, and getting rid of all the No legacy and the Kim Dae-jung legacy of the past. People point to a second issue. Excuse me. So he had explained. He had used a lot of rhetoric called downsizing, decentralization, increasing the efficiency, and deregulating. But as I said, people thought of it as him actually centralizing power in the presidency. Second, people talked about a party purge. In this recent parliamentary election for the GM, and when they were selecting candidates for the parliamentary election, the GMP had gone through this very controversial candidate selection. Basically, they were pushing out all the old guards from the party. And people saw that as Myung-bak purging his own party to establish only those who were loyal to him in the party. So now, not only was he purging the bureaucracy, he was purging his own party to establish a loyal following. A third thing that people have pointed at is his really sweeping policy initiatives that he's implemented in the last 2 months. One, there was inflation, so he announced sweeping price controls. We need to increase South Korea's competitiveness. We got to do sweeping education reform in English. We have to build a Grand Canal. We have to build these large projects. And so a lot of people had compared Lee Myung-bak to, wow, a lot of these things are like Park Chung-hee. And there was an interesting article in the Chungang-ilbo which actually compared Park Chung-hee's administration with Lee's administration of his policies of the last 2 months with Park Chung-hee. And what's important here is there's a lot of parallelism going on here. And finally, people have talked about this recent election, that if Lee comes in and wins a solid majority, then he'll have basically no checks and balances on him. So he could do these policies without anyone. But fortunately or unfortunately, depending on who you talk to, his margin of majority was pretty slim, and now he'll have to build a coalition with the general conservative. But we can talk about that later. But people were concerned about his rulership. A second problem that people have is he being too pro-jebol, too pro-big business. And Jim had mentioned some policies that he's thinking about implementing, some deregulation, and we can talk about this during the Q&A. But one of the policies is lifting investment ceilings on chaebols, allowing them. Now, they used to have these ceilings that were implemented during the Asian financial crisis and so forth, but they're going to lift those. And also ownership of the banks. There were restrictions on non-financial firms owning banks, but now they're thinking about lifting those as well. And during the Asian financial crisis, a lot of the chaebols had bought into these banks and were using these piggy banks to fund their projects, and which contributed to the Asian financial crisis. So the question is Lee Myung-bak deregulating without a strong regulatory regime, a regulatory regime that can make sure that chaebols are behaving in a positive way, or will they be going back to the pre-Asian financial crisis? And that's a question we'll need to consider as we move forward. Two examples is the Hyundai Motors last year. Jung Mong-gu was the chairman was accused and convicted of embezzling money, $100 million from Hyundai Motors, and he was convicted, but his conviction was suspended because basically it was bad for the economy. That was the verdict of the judge, and therefore he wouldn't have to go to prison. And right now, Samsung Corporation, as you probably see in the paper, there's There's some news reports of investigation of them, of Igani establishing a $200 million slush fund. So these are examples of chaebols still abusing the system, and even in a heavy regulatory environment, they're still getting away with things. A third issue that people have been talking about is this natural resource diplomacy. And what this is with the high price of oil and energy and commodity, South Korea have always is particularly concerned about economic security or energy security, because 97% of the natural resources that they import from abroad is imported. And so they're at the whims of these high-priced energy of $100 over $100 a barrel. So Myung-bak has implemented this natural resource diplomacy agenda, where South Korea needs to go and invest in emerging markets in upstream development, basically your mines, your exploration, your production, and so forth, in order to prevent South Korea being shut out from getting these energies at some distant future. And so they've been looking at Latin America, Central Asia, Africa, the Far East, Southeast Asia, and so forth. But, and their goal is by 2013 to reach what's called 20% self-sufficiency. And basically they want to, 20% of the energy that they import is going to be from domestic companies, like the SK Energies and so forth. But what's driving this? Part of it is China. The fear that the Chinese are going out and buying everything in the emerging market, buying up coal mines, buying up oil, and so the Koreans have to get into the act as well. Otherwise, they might get blocked out sometime in the future. A really strange fear that energy analysts here, they scratch their head about. And part of it is maybe domestic politics. There's high energy prices, which is driving high inflation. And so, but what can Korea do about it? And so there's this notion that maybe the government has to do something, and therefore to appear that they are doing something, investing abroad, investing in natural resources, that they're trying to deal with this energy problem. But the question is self-sufficiency, is this a valid logic? Well, if you're 20% self-sufficient, you're 80% still vulnerable to the market. So no matter how much self-sufficiency you achieve in the 20%, you're still going to be at the whims of the market. So is it worth investing all of that to get that kind of autonomy? And also, South Korea is a small player, and they're shooting for these small projects abroad. And they're getting into really risky situations. And the question is, are they paying too much? And they're really small players. Last year, they invested $2 billion total. This year, but ExxonMobil invested $20 billion. So that tells you the level of scale that South Korea is a very small player. And the problem with that is, if you're a small player, then wherever you invest, you're liable to be exploited by the host governments and countries you're investing in. And this is an example. Korea is moving very aggressively into Central Asia to get liquefied natural gas, oil with Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. Can anyone tell me what's wrong with if you pull out the energy and oil and so forth from this area? What's the problem? How do you get it out? How do you get it out? And so the issue of trying to get it out adds to the cost of investing in this area. And one student here mentioned China. China's building a pipeline between Kazakhstan and China. And for the Chinese, it makes sense. But the Chinese aren't going to allow. They have a hard enough time supplying their own economy. So it's a problem. And again, it's very, very risky. And here's another example. South Korea had recently invested. Had cut a deal with the Kurdish regional government. And if some of you have been keeping up with Iraq, the Kurds in the north are having an all-out battle with Baghdad over oil rights. And the South Koreans signed this major deal with the Kurdish regional government, but the oil ministry in Baghdad said, it's not legitimate. We're the only legitimate party who can sign these kinds of deals. And so the South Korean went ahead and signed the agreement. And in February 2008, the Iraqi government shut off 90,000 barrels a day of oil to South Korea. So South Korea is getting into these risky deals just to achieve this so-called self-sufficiency. So what does this all mean? You know, overall, I've been very critical, and we can discuss about my critique. But overall, the folks I talk to on the business side are hopeful and optimistic, and they're very and they look at Korea with a lot of hope, especially with this new president who's very pro-business. And the question is as South Korea moves into a developed economy state, is this you know, do they need an Myung-bak president to move them to the next level? But also, we also have to remember this is just the beginning, and we have 5 more years, and it seems like it's going to be a pretty interesting ride as we look ahead. Thank you.
I'd like to thank James and Abraham for those presentations. Now's the sort of question and answer part of the panel discussion, or whatever we want to call it. And since I'm the moderator and I'm in charge, I've taken it upon myself to ask the first questions, because obviously to me those are the most interesting ones, are the ones that I think up. So let me ask both of our panelists here just a question, and dwell on this as long as you want to sort of adequately answer the question. It's kind of an open-ended question, but what do you both see as sort of the biggest economic challenges that face Korea? And that's really open-ended. So, I mean, you could think of this in terms of in the short run, the medium run, the long run. What are the challenges that are most likely the country as a whole is going to have to face? And then obviously, how would you suspect they would have to deal with these? What would the policies be that would deal with them? Let me give you a couple of things that I thought of. Maybe these are not challenges at all. One thing occurs to me is that there needs to be some sort of movement, as Abraham was suggesting towards the end here, on agreements between Korea and China. How does Korea want to align economically with the Chinese? Right? Is that a major issue that Korea needs to worry about, or something they don't need to worry about? What about the possibility of reunification between North and South Korea? What does that do? Or is that just a pie-in-the-sky thing that we don't even really need to worry about? You mentioned energy security. Is that a major issue? What about things having to do with the domestic economy, like education? You mentioned education reform. What about issues dealing with an aging population? I know this is a big issue in Japan. Was reading in the paper the other day about some sort of a policy initiative that Tokyo has to have some 5 to 10% of the workforce be robots by 25 years from now. So is that would make my life easier, I suppose. Or labor shortages, right? Is the aging population going to create labor shortages? So let me sort of throw those out. Go ahead and discuss. You got the microphones there. Who wants to field the first answer? You want to go, James?
There were several questions involved there. In looking at what some of the biggest economic challenges are, I believe that, I'm sure that Abe can address this one further, but energy security is certainly a huge issue. And then also trying to meet the growth goals that President Lee Myung-bak has given. As I demonstrated in my presentation, in order for them to continue growing and to reach the goals that they've established, it's going to be quite a challenge for a developed country to continue growing at those rates. You were talking about some of the challenges and the costs that would be associated with reunification. Well, if you look at the model Germany had in the 1990s, subsequent to their reunification, it's taken them many years to manage the reunification and to absorb the costs associated with that. And their countries were a lot closer economically than what they are with North and South Korea. I think the North Korean economy is less than 1/10 or 1/20th the size of South Korea's economy. The population, I think, is less than 1/2. It'd be more like if Germany had been reunified with Albania or something, a country that's a lot smaller and a lot more economically backwards. And as far as that being a possibility, it certainly is a possibility. That could happen within the foreseeable future. There is a ministry, as many of you may know, of unification, which looks at these issues. President Lee was looking to disband the Ministry of Unification, but I believe it's still operating. Did you want to address some of the other issues?
Sure. I mean, you mentioned some good issues. I see, just jotting down a couple of things, short run and long run. I think short run issues, I mean, some of the things that they have to address and they haven't really talked about is the labor market. One of the biggest complaints about foreign investments in South Korea is the labor market. And they have one of the strictest labor, essentially you can't freely you can't freely fire people. And so it's created a real problem for international investors and domestic investors for that matter, and increasing labor costs and things like that. And it'll be kind of interesting to watch what Myung-bak addressing these labor market issues. Another short term is this. I had mentioned about deregulation. There's this balance between Myung-bak. In some ways, this year is going to be a tough year for South Korea in terms of economic development. It's slowing down. And one of the main drivers to keep it boosted up is capital investment, getting business to invest, because a lot of the big businesses are sitting on a lot of cash right now. And Myung-bak had promised deregulation. But the question is how do you deregulate and loosen up while ensuring that these businesses will behave in that kind of environment? But you still have to persuade them enough to get them to invest. So there's this kind of real kind of balancing act that Myung-bak has to do. So that's another short-run issue. And the issue of your aging population, Korea has the same problem. People are just not having enough kids. And the social welfare system is going to go bankrupt as well, like in Korea, like in Japan. 2060, I think, is the time frame for Korea that they're going to run out of money in supporting their national pension, for example. So those are, and not running and not having enough people to fill the labor force in the future. So that's some of those short run and long run issues I see.
Let me ask another question. I mean, we've talked a little bit about this 747 thing, 7% growth, become the 7th largest economy in the world. As an economist, this kind of strikes me as really, really ambitious. And I guess one of the questions I have is, where the heck does the administration think the growth is going to come from? Right? I mean, is there anything actually laid out in these policy proposals that says we're going to get 7% growth and this is how we're going to do it?
I believe that President Lee is hoping to fuel growth through the deregulation and the business-friendly policies by trying to promote more exports and fuel the chaebol to continue this growth.
So it's going to be like productivity gains? Is this
right?
Increases in productivity. I mean, because growth's either got to come from either increases in productivity, or it's got to come from you got a bigger capital stock, you got more workers, you got some factors of production that you've got more of as a result of this. So.
Well, I think part of it was an animal of the presidential election. It was an election year.
Right,
and everyone was saying 6%. And Myung-bak in some ways wanted to outdo everyone, and he said 7%. So, and a lot of economists came out during the election saying, this is ridiculous. You can never, drive the economy that fast. And then he didn't anticipate the global credit crunch, as well as the wild inflation and the high oil prices that went beyond $100. And now they're backtracking not only 6%, but they're saying around 6%, which means probably below 6%. And so, but I mean, he's depending a lot on the chaebols to fuel a lot of this growth by investing a lot of their cash into capital investment, as well as drawing in foreign direct investment. And they said it's a goal, and Koreans tend to think big, and if they don't reach it, then they make they say, well, we tried, but Myung-bak has always been known for big thinking, and a lot of people have told him he can't do it, and he built the Cheonggyecheon thing, and now he's going to try to build a canal thing through Korea, and
you could build one to Kazakhstan too.
Yeah, to Kazakhstan too. So a lot of it, I think, is maybe politically driven in some ways. So.
You were just talking about the canal and some of the criticisms. An interesting article that I've read. North Korea has actually come out and criticized Lee Myung-bak's idea of the Grand Canal. They pointed out, why do you need a Grand Canal when you have ocean on 3 sides of the peninsula? Sure. When you have well-developed rail infrastructure and highways.
And you're building it through mountains, right?
Right. So I just thought it was interesting that the North Koreans felt like they had to weigh in on it as well, since everybody else had.
All right, are there any questions from the floor? Oh, come on, yes.
I have a question with regards, you're talking about how the economy will be affected by unification.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think that would affect policy decisions towards unification, whether they want to delay it or kind of put it off until they feel they're strong enough and ready to integrate with the North Korean economy?
Oh, boy. Gordon, you want to take this one? There are a lot of concerns about what were to happen if there were to be a regime collapse tomorrow in North Korea. There are concerns not only from South Korea but from China as well about the humanitarian crisis. I mean, China is concerned now with the number of refugees which come across into China. It's an ongoing concern of theirs, and if there were to be a regime collapse, they're concerned about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people coming across the borders and dealing with that. South Korea has been working on these issues with the Ministry of Unification, and without a doubt it would take years to bring up the economy of the North to that of the South, and to deal with the humanitarian issues as well. The infrastructure up there, they would need to rebuild the roads, the energy infrastructure, the transmission and distribution is very weak. The system for that is very weak, and in addition to the generation capacity that they have, the entire economy just had to be overhauled. It would take many years and a lot of patience in order to accomplish that.
My view is a little bit controversial because I don't think reunification will come by choice. I think reunification will come by as a crisis management situation. My personal view is very few people are going to be negotiating a long-term deal for reunification. Reunification happens because no one expected it to happen. And that's what happened in the German case. And it happened in the Yemen case, too. Very few people know that Yemen unified, but Yemen unified it. And in some ways, I think reunification is going to come because it's the best worst-case scenario that the people have. And like Jim had mentioned, there's refugee issues and you know, chaos and things like that slowly develop. Right now, it's not the case, but I really think these things are negotiated long-term back and forth, and then it just happens gradually. I think it'll happen quick and in a big catastrophic way, and a lot of people are not going to be prepared for it. So,
Any other questions?
How do you take Myung-bak's position toward North Korea? It's on the one hand, it is described as tougher. The North Koreans are upset about Myung-bak's election because they've responded with firing off a missile and kicking the government people out of the Kaesong joint venture thing. And so they're giving signals that they're not happy with the defeat of the Sunshine Policy and this new Myung-bak policy. I personally don't think he's that tough on North Korea. Mm-hmm. And he has within his policy objectives certain things about training North Koreans and incorporating North Korea into the South Korean economy and doing these joint venture things more, you know, building on the role model of the Kaesong venture. And he seems more pragmatic than doctrinaire about this thing. I mean, if we had an ideologue up there that was just anti-communist no matter what, I think we wouldn't see much flexibility. But because he's a pragmatist, first and foremost, I think his anti-North Korean policy isn't really very anti. It's just sort of a slightly tougher line than what we had before. What are your views on that?
I would agree that it's certainly not an anti-North Korean policy. He has not said, we're going to shut down Kaesong tomorrow until you fully denuclearize. He said that they want to expand Kaesong until North Korea fully denuclearizes. And he's made put a lot of great offers out there to help them develop their economy, but they're all conditional. I think that he's using a carrot, but not, I mean, he hasn't threatened any punitive action, at least that I'm aware of, against North Korea. He's just using the carrot and using all these incentives based upon North Korea denuclearizing.
You know, the recent events, it's interesting if you know, when the rhetoric started coming out and they started kicking out the Kaesong, you know, South Korean officials from Kaesong and even Kaesong and now Kumgang as well, a couple of days ago. You know, a lot of this was preceded by some pretty tough stance from the South Koreans too. I mean, there were some kind of significant announcements. One was, you know, Unification Minister coming out and saying, we're not going to expand Kaesong until there's progress on the denuclearization issue. The Korean Joint Chief of Staff came out and said, and he was put into a kind of a tough situation by the National Assembly, but he was essentially made the statement where if a threat was imminent, then the South Korean military would preempt. And then Myung-bak also came out with demands that, you know, we need abductees back, we need all these things back. And then there was a response from the North Korean side saying, well, if you're going to preempt us, then we're going to, you know, turn you into a sea of fire and ashes or something. And it was a response from the North Koreans. So there was this kind of back and forth thing going on. Yes, and you know, the recent events, it is are frustrations by the North Koreans that of the lack of progress, but and the changing atmosphere between North-South relations. But as there's some recent developments that I think my colleagues in the second panel will probably talk about regarding on the North Korea side, U.S.-North Korea and the six-party talk stuff. But I mean, from Myung-bak's perspective, I agree with you. He's pragmatic, and the last thing he wants is to create a disruption because he has to focus on the domestic economy and get the economy going. And so creating this problem in the North certainly doesn't help that situation. And
And a lot of his policies, in some ways, this whole kind of 3,000 vision, North Korea vision, or I forgot the exact name of it, where he's going to try to increase the per capita in North Korea to $3,000. All of that is based on North Korea opening up as well, which is a poison pill for the North Koreans, for all we know. So, there's a kind of a thorn in those offers to the North Koreans as well. So.
Okay, well, why don't we take a 10-minute break for the next panel? Everybody can go back and get a choco pie. Let's give a round of applause to our two presenters.